The moment resistance ended, the situation changed. The mission was over, but the experience was only beginning. In the autumn of 1967, American military operations in South Vietnam extended across a landscape where the boundaries between controlled and contested territory shifted constantly. Units operated in zones where friendly forces maintained a presence during daylight hours, but withdrew at night. Reconnaissance teams moved through areas where enemy forces had established supply routes and staging areas. Helicopter crews flew missions over terrain where anti-aircraft positions were concealed beneath jungle canopy. The risk of becoming separated from support was inherent in these operations. For some, that separation led to capture. The transition from combatant to prisoner occurred in various ways, but the common element was the loss of options. A soldier who found himself surrounded, low on ammunition with no avenue for withdrawal, faced a decision that offered no good outcome. Resistance meant certain death. Surrender meant an uncertain future. The choice, when it came, was made quickly. There was no time for extended deliberation. The situation resolved itself in moments. This is an account of what happened after capture. It is not a story of heroic resistance or dramatic escape. It is a description of adjustment, of the methods men used to endure conditions that stripped away control, and of the psychological demands of surviving as a prisoner when the duration of captivity remained unknown. In September 1967, a four-man long-range reconnaissance patrol was operating in the highlands west of Pleiku. The team had been inserted 3 days earlier to monitor enemy movement along a suspected infiltration route. The mission was proceeding normally. The team observed, recorded, and transmitted information at scheduled intervals. On the third night, the team was compromised. The exact circumstances were never fully determined. An enemy patrol may have detected signs of their presence, or local civilians may have reported unusual activity. Whatever the cause, the team found itself under fire before dawn. The engagement was brief and one-sided. The enemy force was larger and had the advantage of surprise. 2 members of the team were hit in the initial exchange. The team leader attempted to organize a withdrawal, but the terrain offered no covered route. The radio operator transmitted a distress call, but extraction was not possible. The helicopter response time was too long, and the enemy force was too close. Within minutes, the situation became untenable. The team leader made the decision to cease fire. He raised his weapon above his head and stepped into the open. The shooting stopped. Enemy soldiers moved forward, weapons trained on the Americans. The team members were ordered to the ground. They complied. Hands were bound behind their backs using rope. The 2 wounded men were searched and their injuries examined briefly. No, treatment was provided immediately. The team's weapons and equipment were collected. Within 10 minutes of the decision to surrender, the patrol was moving away from the site under guard. The first hours as prisoners were marked by disorientation. The men were moved quickly through forest along trails they had not seen before. The guards spoke no English and offered no explanation of where they were being taken. The prisoners walked in single file, bound and silent. The wounded men were assisted by the other team members when the guards permitted it. The pace was demanding. Rest stops were infrequent and brief. Water was provided occasionally. No food was given. The march continued through the day and into the following night. The prisoners lost track of distance and direction. They were deep in territory they did not recognize. The likelihood of rescue diminished with each hour of movement. By the second day, the team understood that they were beyond the reach of friendly forces. The immediate danger of being killed had passed, but the future remained unclear. They had become prisoners, but they did not know what that meant in practical terms. On the third day, the group arrived at a temporary camp. The prisoners were placed in a bamboo structure with a thatched roof and a dirt floor. The structure was guarded. The prisoners were not separated. They were permitted to sit and rest. The wounded men were examined again, this time more carefully. An enemy medic cleaned the wounds and applied bandages. No antibiotics were administered, but the basic care suggested that the prisoners were not going to be executed immediately. Food was brought to the structure in the late afternoon. It consisted of rice and boiled vegetables. The portions were small. The prisoners ate in silence. They were exhausted and beginning to feel the effects of limited food and water. The psychological adjustment to their new status was underway, but it was not complete. They still thought of themselves as soldiers on a mission. The reality that the mission had ended and that they were now dependent on their captors had not fully settled. The guards rotated throughout the night. The prisoners were not permitted to leave the structure except to relieve themselves under close supervision. Sleep was difficult, the floor was hard, and the prisoners remained bound. The uncertainty about what would happen next made rest nearly impossible. Some of the team members whispered to each other when the guards were not immediately present, but conversations were brief. There was little to say. The situation was what it was. After 2 days at the temporary camp, the prisoners were moved again. This time the journey was longer. They traveled for nearly 2 weeks, moving steadily northward through increasingly mountainous terrain. The trails became steeper, the weather turned cooler at higher elevations. The prisoners walked in the same clothing they had worn during the patrol. The fabric became soiled and torn. Their boots began to deteriorate. Blisters formed on their feet and became infected. The guards maintained the pace regardless of the prisoners' physical condition. During the march, the prisoners were given minimal food. Meals consisted of rice, sometimes supplemented with small amounts of dried fish or vegetables. The caloric intake was insufficient for the energy being expended. The prisoners began to lose weight. Hunger became a constant companion. The physical discomfort was significant, but the psychological adjustment was more challenging. The prisoners had no information about their destination, no knowledge of how long the march would continue, and no contact with anyone who could explain what was happening to them. The wounded men struggled more than the others. Their injuries, which had received only basic treatment, were not healing properly. Infection set in. One man developed a fever that persisted for days. The guards permitted the other prisoners to assist him, but no additional medical care was provided. The man survived through the combination of his own resilience and the support of his teammates. The experience reinforced the understanding that survival in captivity would depend partly on mutual assistance. When the march finally ended, the prisoners arrived at a more permanent facility. The camp was located in a valley surrounded by steep hills covered with dense vegetation. The compound consisted of several buildings made from wood and bamboo. A fence constructed from sharpened bamboo stakes surrounded the perimeter. Guard towers were positioned at corners. The camp was designed to hold prisoners, and it was clear that others had been held there before. The processing upon arrival was methodical. The prisoners were photographed individually. Their personal information was recorded. They were asked to state their names, ranks, units, and serial numbers. They provided this information in accordance with their training. They were then assigned to a cell within one of the buildings. The cell was small, approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, with a single barred window near the ceiling. 4 wooden sleeping platforms occupied most of the floor space. The cell held 8 men. The other occupants were American soldiers who had been captured in previous operations. Some had been prisoners for several months. One had been held for over a year. The new arrivals were greeted with caution. The established prisoners assessed the newcomers, determining whether they could be trusted and whether they posed any risk to the fragile stability that had been established within the cell. After initial introductions, information was exchanged carefully. The new arrivals learned the basic routines of the camp. The established prisoners learned news from the outside, updates about the progress of the war, and any information about negotiations or prisoner exchanges. The daily routine in the camp was rigid and unchanging. Prisoners woke at dawn when a guard banged on the cell door. They were permitted to use a latrine located outside the building under supervision. Water for washing was available from a communal trough. The water was cold and often dirty. Prisoners washed quickly and returned to their cells. Breakfast was delivered shortly after. It consisted of rice and occasionally a thin vegetable soup. The portions were measured carefully and were barely adequate. After breakfast, prisoners were allowed into a small courtyard for exercise. The exercise period lasted approximately 30 minutes. The prisoners walked in circles around the courtyard or performed basic calisthenics. Guards watched from the perimeter. Conversation during exercise was permitted but monitored. Prisoners learned to speak quietly and to avoid discussing topics that might provoke the guards. The exercise period was the only time during the day when prisoners from different cells could interact directly. The remainder of the day was spent in the cells. There was no work assigned, no activities organized, no materials provided for reading or occupation. The prisoners sat or lay on their sleeping platforms and waited. Some talked quietly with their cellmates. Others remained silent, lost in their own thoughts. The passage of time became difficult to track. Without clocks or calendars, the days blended together. Some prisoners scratched marks on the walls to count days. Others relied on the established prisoners to maintain an approximate calendar. Lunch was served in the early afternoon. It was similar to breakfast. Rice formed the basis of the meal, sometimes accompanied by boiled greens or small pieces of root vegetables. Protein was rare. When it appeared, it was typically a small portion of dried fish or occasionally pork fat. The prisoners ate slowly, making the meal last as long as possible. Eating provided a break in the monotony, and the prisoners extended it as much as they could. Dinner was served in the evening and followed the same pattern. After the evening meal, the prisoners remained in their cells until lights were extinguished at nightfall. Sleep came with difficulty. The sleeping platforms were hard and narrow. The cells were either too hot or too cold depending on the season. Mosquitoes were abundant. Some prisoners developed chronic sleep problems, lying awake for hours in the darkness. Others slept fitfully, waking frequently throughout the night. The psychological challenge of captivity became apparent within the first weeks. The prisoners had transitioned from active soldiers with missions and purposes to men whose only function was to wait. The loss of purpose was profound. There were no objectives to achieve, no tasks to complete, no progress to measure. Each day was the same as the one before. The future stretched forward without definition. The prisoners did not know how long they would be held. They did not know if they would be released. Through negotiation, through prisoner exchange, or only at the end of the war. The uncertainty was constant and oppressive. Some prisoners attempted to create structure through self-discipline. They established personal routines within the broader routine of the camp. They exercised in their cells, performing push-ups, sit-ups, and other exercises that required no equipment. They set goals for themselves, attempting to increase the number of repetitions each week. The exercise served multiple purposes. It helped maintain physical strength. It occupied time. It provided measurable progress in an environment where progress of any kind was rare. Others focused on mental exercise. They recited information from memory, reviewing everything they had learned in school, in military training, and in life. They reconstructed technical manuals, recalling specifications and procedures in detail. They composed letters in their minds, writing to family members even though they had no paper and no means of sending the letters. The mental activity kept their minds engaged and prevented the kind of mental deterioration that came from prolonged inactivity. Communication between prisoners became essential for maintaining morale. In cells that held multiple men, conversations provided relief from isolation. The prisoners talked about their lives before the war, about their families, about their plans for the future. They shared stories from their military service, recounting experiences that seemed distant now. They discussed the war itself, analyzing what they knew about its progress and speculating about how long it might continue. These conversations were conducted quietly to avoid attracting the attention of guards. The prisoners also developed covert communication methods to contact men in other cells. The primary method was a tap code system. The code was simple but effective. Each letter of the alphabet was represented by a specific combination of taps. Messages could be transmitted through the walls by tapping quietly with knuckles or small objects. The taps were soft enough to avoid detection, but clear enough to be heard in adjacent cells. Through this system, prisoners shared information, offered encouragement, and maintained a sense of connection with the broader prisoner community. The tap code allowed for the establishment of an informal command structure. Senior officers, when they could be identified, assumed responsibility for providing guidance. They transmitted orders and policies through the tap code network. They established rules regarding conduct during interrogations. They organized the observance of American holidays. They maintained discipline and ensured that prisoners continued to function as members of a military organization, even in captivity. Interrogations were a regular feature of camp life. Prisoners were brought individually to a room where they were questioned by enemy officers. The interrogator spoke English with varying degrees of fluency. They asked questions about military operations, unit strengths, tactics, and equipment. The prisoners responded according to the code of conduct, providing only name, rank, service number, and date of birth. They refused to provide additional information. The interrogators employed various methods to encourage cooperation. They began with straightforward questioning, repeating the same questions across multiple sessions. When this proved ineffective, they shifted to offering incentives. They suggested that cooperation would result in better food, medical care, or the opportunity to write home. They showed prisoners propaganda materials, including photographs of anti-war protests in the United States, and suggested that the American public had abandoned the war effort. They asked prisoners to acknowledge the information presented or to make statements that could be used for propaganda purposes. Most prisoners refused these offers. They understood that cooperation would be used against them and against the broader war effort. They maintained their adherence to the code of conduct despite the pressure. The interrogators responded to resistance with various forms of punishment. Prisoners who refused to cooperate were sometimes denied meals. Others were placed in isolation. The isolation cells were smaller than the regular cells and offered no light. Time in isolation could last for days or weeks. The experience was psychologically difficult, and some prisoners found their resolve tested by extended periods alone. The physical conditions in the camp created additional challenges. The diet was inadequate for maintaining health. Prisoners lost weight steadily during their first months in captivity. Men who had weighed 170 or 180 pounds upon capture found themselves reduced to 130 or 140 pounds. The weight loss weakened them physically and made them more susceptible to illness. The camp's sanitation was poor. Latrines were simple pit toilets that overflowed during heavy rains. Drinking water came from sources that were not reliably clean. Dysentery was common. Prisoners suffered from chronic diarrhea that further weakened them. Medical care in the camp was minimal. A small clinic was staffed by an enemy medic who provided basic treatment. Prisoners with minor injuries or illnesses received limited attention. Wounds were cleaned and bandaged. Prisoners with fevers were given aspirin when it was available. Serious medical conditions went untreated. Prisoners with infections that required antibiotics did not receive them. Prisoners with chronic conditions had no access to necessary medications. Some prisoners developed health problems that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The seasonal changes brought different hardships. During the monsoon season, the camp became saturated with water. Rain fell continuously for days. The cells flooded. The sleeping platforms remained damp. Clothing never dried. The prisoners developed skin problems from the constant moisture. Fungal infections spread, feet remained wet, and the skin deteriorated. During the dry season, the heat became intense. The cells, which had no ventilation, became stifling. Water rations were reduced. Dehydration became a constant concern. The prisoners adapted to the seasonal cycles, but the adaptation required constant effort. The passage of time wore on the prisoners in ways that were not immediately visible. The initial weeks of captivity were marked by shock and adjustment. The prisoners were still processing what had happened to them. They maintained the expectation that captivity might be temporary, that rescue or negotiated release might occur. As weeks became months, that expectation faded. The realization that captivity might last for years settled over them. This realization brought a different kind of challenge. It was no longer a matter of enduring a temporary hardship. It was a matter of finding ways to survive indefinitely. Some prisoners struggled with this adjustment. They became withdrawn, speaking less, engaging less with their cellmates. They performed the required routines mechanically, but showed little interest in anything beyond basic survival. Others found strength in routine and discipline. They maintained their exercise regimens, their mental exercises, and their participation in the prisoner community. They focused on small goals and small achievements. Each day survived was a victory, even if it was a quiet one. The relationships between prisoners evolved over the months and years. Initial caution gave way to trust. Prisoners learned who could be relied upon and who could not. Bonds formed between men who shared cells, who supported each other through illness, and who maintained each other's morale during difficult periods. These relationships became a source of strength, the knowledge that others were enduring the same conditions, that the burden was shared, made it slightly more bearable. Religious faith provided support for some. Prisoners who had grown up with religious training found comfort in prayer and scripture. They recited prayers from memory, conducted mental services, and found meaning in their suffering through the lens of faith. The camp did not permit organized religious practice, but individual prisoners maintained their beliefs privately. On Sundays, some prisoners observed a period of quiet reflection. They recited the Lord's Prayer or other prayers they remembered. These practices provided structure and comfort. The observation of American holidays became an important ritual. The prisoners marked Thanksgiving, Christmas, Independence Day, and other significant dates. They did so quietly within their cells, but the observance mattered. On Thanksgiving, prisoners shared whatever extra food they had managed to save. On Christmas, they sang carols, quietly. On the 4th of July, they recited the Pledge of Allegiance. These small acts of recognition connected them to their identity as Americans and to the world beyond the camp. Mail from home, when it arrived, had an enormous impact. Letters were rare and heavily censored. Large sections were blacked out or removed entirely, but even partial letters provided connection. Prisoners learned that their families knew they were alive. They received updates on children, on parents, on the ordinary events of life continuing in their absence. The letters were read repeatedly until the paper wore thin. They were treasured as proof that the world outside the camp still existed and still included the prisoners within it. The ability to send letters was equally important. When prisoners were permitted to write, they composed their messages carefully. They knew the letters would be censored, so they avoided any information that might be useful to the enemy. They focused on personal, on reassurances, on expressions of love for family members, on hope for the future. The act of writing provided a sense of connection and agency. Even if the letter never reached its destination, the act of composing it mattered. As the war continued, new prisoners arrived periodically. They brought news from the outside, updates on military operations, and information about political developments. The established prisoners listened carefully to these accounts. The new arrivals often had more current information about peace negotiations and public sentiment in the United States. This information was valuable, but it was also filtered through the recent trauma of capture. The established prisoners learned to weigh what they heard, extracting useful facts while accounting for the emotional state of those providing the information. The arrival of new prisoners also meant changes in cell assignments. The camp authorities periodically reorganized the prisoner population, moving men to different cells or different sections of the camp. These moves disrupted the communication networks and relationships that had been established. Prisoners who had developed close bonds with cellmates suddenly found themselves with strangers. The disruption was deliberate. The camp authorities understood that prisoner cohesion threatened their control. By periodically reorganizing, they prevented the formation of stable leadership structures. Despite these efforts, the prisoner community maintained its coherence. The tap code system continued to function. Messages were passed between cells regardless of the reorganizations. The informal command structure adapted to changes in the prisoner population. Senior officers continued to provide guidance and maintain discipline. The prisoners understood that maintaining their identity as American soldiers was essential to their psychological survival. They were not simply captives. They were prisoners of war, subject to a chain of command, accountable to standards that existed beyond the walls of the camp. The psychological endurance required to survive extended captivity was extraordinary. The prisoners had no control over their circumstances. Every aspect of their lives was regulated by others. They could not choose what they ate, where they slept, when they spoke, or how they spent their time. The loss of autonomy was complete. Yet within that constrained existence, the prisoners found small ways to assert themselves. They maintained personal hygiene as best they could. They refused to let their minds go idle. They remembered who they were and held on to the identities they had carried into the war. The experience of captivity forced prisoners to confront fundamental questions about endurance, duty, and purpose. They had been trained to fight, to lead, to complete missions. In captivity, none of those skills directly applied. The mission became simply to survive with dignity intact. There were no medals for this kind of endurance, no public recognition. The prisoners endured because the alternative was to give up, and giving up meant losing something essential. In the early months of 1973, the atmosphere in the camp began to change. The guards became less hostile. Interrogations became less frequent. There were subtle indications that something was different, though no official announcement was made. The prisoners discussed these changes among themselves, trying to interpret what they meant. Some believed that peace negotiations were nearing conclusion. Others remained skeptical, having heard similar rumors before. In late February, the prisoners were informed that a peace agreement had been signed and that they would be released in accordance with its terms. The announcement was made without ceremony. The prisoners were told to prepare for transport to Hanoi, where they would be turned over to American officials. The news was received with a mixture of relief and caution. The prisoners had learned not to trust announcements fully until events actually occurred. They would believe in their release when they were on American aircraft, heading away from Vietnamese territory. The release was conducted in stages over several weeks. Prisoners were processed in groups, brought to Hanoi, and transferred to American control. The transition was abrupt. Men who had spent months or years in cells suddenly found themselves in the care of American medical personnel and military officials. They were examined, debriefed, and prepared for transport. They were given new uniforms and fed meals that contained more food than they had seen in captivity. Some prisoners found it difficult to eat large portions after extended malnutrition. Their bodies needed time to adjust. The flight out of Vietnam was emotional. As the aircraft lifted off and gained altitude, the prisoners understood that they were truly leaving. The country that had held them was falling away beneath them. The relief was profound, but it was accompanied by complex emotions. Many prisoners thought about those who had not survived, about men who had died in the camps or who had been killed before they could be captured. The joy of freedom was tempered by the memory of those who would not return. The return to the United States brought its own challenges. The country had changed during the prisoners' absence. The war had become deeply unpopular. The returning prisoners found themselves in an awkward position. They had served and suffered, but the cause they had served was now widely questioned. The public reception was mixed. There were ceremonies and recognition, but there was also indifference and criticism. Some prisoners struggled with this reception, having endured years of captivity believing that their sacrifice had meaning. Reunions with family were complex. Years had passed. Spouses had aged. Children had grown. Everyone had changed. The prisoners themselves were different men than they had been. The experience of captivity had altered them in fundamental ways. Some families adjusted successfully to the reunion. Others struggled. The gap created by years of separation could not be closed immediately. It required time, patience, and understanding. The physical recovery took months. The prisoners required medical and dental care. They needed to regain weight, rebuild strength, and address chronic health problems developed during captivity. Some conditions could be treated. Others were permanent. The prisoners adapted, learning to live with limitations that would remain for life. The psychological recovery was more complicated. Many experienced symptoms that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress. They had nightmares and flashbacks. They struggled with situations that reminded them of captivity. Some sought help, others tried to manage on their own. The understanding of trauma was less developed then than it would become later. Many received less support than they needed. What captivity in Vietnam revealed was the capacity of ordinary men to endure extraordinary circumstances. The prisoners were not heroes in a traditional sense. They did not win battles. They simply refused to be broken. They found ways to preserve themselves in an environment designed to strip away identity and autonomy. They maintained their humanity when it would have been easier to retreat into numbness. That endurance, quiet and unglamorous, was its own form of resistance. It was proof that the human spirit, when tested, can find within itself resources that are not apparent until they are needed. This is what happened after capture in Vietnam. This is how men survived when survival was all that remained. Please subscribe to my channel to support me so I can produce videos like this daily.